Welcome to the second day of Google I/O. I hope everybody is enjoying their new toys and future new toys. That was quite an announcement at the keynote. This is GWT and UI Designer Enterprise Web UIs Made Easy. I'm Eric Clayberg. The hashtags for this session, I/O 2001 DevTools, and there's the link for feedback. If you'd like to leave something, we'd love to have feedback. The agenda for this session, I'm going to go through a quick introduction, go through some of the basics of the UI Designer tool, do a quick basic demonstration of some of those features, then go into some of the more advanced features, do a second demo at the end of the session, then we'll wrap up, open it up for Q&A, and let you go about your business. So who am I and what is the UI Designer? A little background. Again, I'm Eric Clayberg. I'm a software engineering manager with the Developer Tools group at Google. Formerly, I was with Instantiations, a Java Eclipse toolmaker acquired by Google in 2010. How many of you were familiar with Instantiations in the past? Oh, great. Thanks. I'm also co-author with Dan Rubel of the book Eclipse Plugins. Anybody read my book? Well, thank you for that. You can reach me at clayberg@google.com. GWT Designer was a tool originally created by Instantiations in 2006. It was acquired by Google in 2010, and September of last year we made it free to everybody who wanted to use it, which is pretty cool. It was also fully integrated with the Google plugin for Eclipse, or the GPE version 2.2, as the built-in UI Designer. It comes in two versions. There's the embedded version in the GPE. There's also still a full version that provides access to various third-party components like GXT, Smart GWT, and a few other things that I'll mention. And the whole thing is built on the new Window Builder open source project at eclipse.org that Google contributed back in December and is going to go out as part of Eclipse 3.7 in June. So the basics of the UI design, before I go on, how many people have actually played with the tool? It was called GWT Designer in the past, now it's just the UI Designer and the GPE. All right, great. Well, hopefully I'll be able to teach you a few tricks that you might not have run across yet. But for those of you who aren't familiar with it, we'll talk about some of the basics. So the user interface of the tool is composed of the following major components. There's the source view, where you see all your Java source, or if you're using UI Binder, you'd see the XML source. Switch to the Design tab, you see the Design surface, which has a bunch of subcomponents to it. In the upper left-hand corner, you have the component tree, where you see a hierarchical view of all the components. You have a property pane, where you can edit the properties. There's a palette. There are a large number of wizards you can access to create different UI components. And then the various toolbar and context menu options. I'll touch on each of these in a little bit more detail. Source view. Again, there are separate tabs for the source and the design view. You can switch back and forth between those very easily. If you're someone who likes to see the design view and the source view simultaneously, you can also put it into a mode where you can see both of them in a top-bottom or left-right configuration like this. The design view, basically each different type of layout or GWT panel type has its own unique UI model and different visual feedback. You can move and resize components visually. If you hit the space bar, you can put it into direct edit mode to change labels on text labels, checkboxes, buttons, things of that nature. Depending on the layout manager, things like layout panels, you can also right-click to set attachments using pop-up context menus. The component tree, again, is a hierarchical view of all the components. It shows the variable name of the component, the text of the component. You can right-click to cut, copy, and paste, use drag-drop to reorder and nest components. And that component tree can be docked on any side of the editor or even pulled off as a standalone view if you prefer. The properties view shows all of the standard common properties by default. If you want, you can also reveal various advanced properties by clicking the little icon in the corner. Those are properties you typically don't need to access, but you might, if you need to, you can get to them. All of the most important properties are highlighted in bold so you can see them quickly. There are commands to automatically convert a widget from a local variable to a field. By default, the tool will create components as local variables, which is nice for things like labels or things that you don't need to communicate with. But for things like checkboxes or text fields where you might want to programmatically interact with them, you can convert them with a single click into fields in the application. You can also directly access and jump right to the source code for a particular widget you're dealing with. You can also switch over to the configured events for any component very easily. You can also, if you right-click, you can tell the system what you consider to be the preferred or advanced properties yourself. So you can actually fine-tune the tool a bit. The palette has some commands for doing system or marquee level select. You can choose any components, whether they're on the palette or not, using the choose component command. So that's nice if you've created your own custom components or you have some third-party components that aren't on the palette yet, you can easily access them. In the full version, there are special palettes for GXT and Smart GWT, and you can add your own palettes and categories very easily. Just like the property pane and component tree, you can dock the palette to any side of the editor or pull it off into a separate standalone view. And the palette is also fully customizable by the user. So if you right-click on it, you can get this customization dialog where you can rearrange the categories, add, remove widgets, export the palette to XML file to share it with other developer members. You can actually, if you actually store the palette in the project, then that project will automatically adapt to that palette. So if you've got a project, you're working with a team and you want to configure the palette for the entire team, you can do that very easily. Just store the palette file in the project. Everybody in the team will then use that same palette. The full version has a very large number of UI wizards, which you can access using the File, New, Other, Window Builder, WIT Designer link. There's also a drop-down toolbar menu on the main Eclipse toolbar that you can access that shows those various categories. And there are dozens of templates for creating GWT Java, UI Binder, MVP, GXT, and Smart GWT components. And finally, a large number of context menu commands, toolbar options, things like cut, copy, paste, alignment and distribution, deleting components, ordering and selecting components, renaming components. If you want to rename multiple instance variables at the same time, you can do that. Add event handlers and access morphing and factory tools. And this is just a quick comparison of the two main flavors of the UI Designer, the embedded version versus the fuller version. Again, both versions support all the standard GWT widgets and panel types. Both support both Java and UI Binder-based UIs. The full version adds support for additional third-party widgets like GXT and Smart GWT. There's also a much larger number of built-in wizards accessible. The full version also has a lot more customization options, but the basic version has sort of the primary ones you need. And the most important thing is both versions are completely free thanks to Google. So now I'm going to jump into a quick demo of some of the basic features. So here I have a standard entry point, very simple Java class. It shows up as an empty box in this case. The root panel by default is in a sort of absolute layout. So if I were to drop various widgets, notice you get various drop feedback. There are margin alignments you can select. If I drop it in the corner, that widget will go there. Automatically goes into direct edit mode. Give it a name. And notice it automatically selected the variable name based on the text I entered. If I add a second widget, notice you get automatic alignment, drop zones if you want. I can also drop and resize a widget at the same time. And there are handy commands in the toolbar for doing things like left, right, center alignment, making the widgets all the same size, distributing them horizontally, vertically, centering them, all kinds of things like that for absolute layouts. Some of the, I mentioned that the palette and this structure view composed of the component and property view are, you can move them around, so if I want to, I can just drag the palette to the other side of the screen if you like that particular layout. And again, if I right-click, I can bring up the palette manager and rearrange the categories, remove categories that I'm not using, remove widgets that I'm not using, add widgets that I might have that I've created custom, and then easily export that and share that with other team members. Other types of layouts, as I mentioned, they all have different feedbacks. A standard flow panel, I'll just drop one of these in here. And if I drop some widgets on that, you see that they just basically drop in a left-right manner, and I can drop widgets in between other widgets, and they flow appropriately according to that particular layout. Show you a grid and a flex table. A grid is basically rows and columns, so the first widget I drop in goes into the only available cell. Then I can basically add new rows and columns by dropping on any of the sides of the existing layout here. So I automatically add a new column and add a new row, and you can do things like tell it to a widget to fill a particular cell if you want to. Oops. Very simple. Now that the grid widget, the grid panel is quite simple. Contrast that with the flex table, which as its name suggests is a bit more flexible. Once I drop a few widgets in here, I can do a couple additional things. Let me get a couple in here. Tell this to fill. But then I can do things like have it span multiple rows and columns. So by dragging this little green handle over, I can have that widget expand to fill an entire row or an entire column very easily. And again, if I want to direct edit, I can just hit the space bar and put the widget in a direct edit to change its labels. Over here on the property view, you can see all the various properties for the component in context. Some of these properties are expandable to show you various sub-properties, such as various alignment options, things like that. You can also set things like CSS styles and so on. And I'll show that actually in the more advanced demo. All right, now I'm going to switch back to the slides here. So let's talk about some of the more advanced features of the tool where it starts to get really interesting. So the tool has quite a few pretty interesting features. Many of them are actually quite unique for a Java-based UI designer. First, obviously, almost any GUI builder needs to have WYSIWYG layout. But one of the nice things we have is a truly bidirectional code generation. So as we start editing in the design view, if I showed you the source view, as I add widgets, you'll see those automatically added to the source view. Add a second widget, add a third widget. And then if I go into the source view and make a change in the source view, that change is immediately reflected in the design view. So you can actually work comfortably in either place, and the tool will automatically parse back and forth in either direction. One nice aspect about, one of the nice features of this is something we call micro-editing. So if you were to go into the design view, change the label on a component, it makes the smallest possible change to the source code that it can. So in this case, it will update just that one string. Now, the nice thing about that is if you've actually formatted your code or refactored your code or moved things around, it doesn't rewrite the entire class. It actually has an AST model of the entire UI class. It knows exactly where that string is. It changes just that string for you. I think it's one of the only UI tools in the world that actually works that way. I mentioned the parser. It has a very powerful and flexible code parser. Not only can it parse its own code, it can generally parse most handwritten code quite well. Typically in the 80–90% range, we're quite successful with that. There are no protected code blocks. So there's nothing that says, your code must go here. You can basically put your own modifications anywhere you like. since it creates an AST structure of the entire UI class, it knows exactly where the UI code is. It can differentiate that from model code or other code that you might have written by hand. It has a very nice understanding of data flow. So if you were to refactor an existing layout, maybe rather than having all of these widgets defined in one method, you could actually use extract method, pull a few of them out into a second method, and it'll be perfectly happy. It'll continue to update the widgets in whatever method they're in, and so on. Ignores and preserves non-UI code. So again, if you've added your own code in line or anywhere in the class, it'll ignore it, preserve it, the formatting remains unchanged. Again, since it's making micro edits, there's never a point where it regenerates the entire class and messes up the formatting or does anything like that. Again, very refactoring friendly and resilient to handmade changes. And one key aspect is that there is a true one-to-one relationship between what you see in the UI design and what's in the Java or XML code for UI binder. There's no secondary metadata file that are often used in other UI tools that can get out of sync. So the tool basically parses the Java code, and everything about the design is derived from that. There's nothing else that you need to worry about. The tool can read and write almost any style. So if you have a particular style of Java coding that you like, you can actually adapt the output to almost anything you like. So for example, when generating new widgets, you can have them generated as local variables or as fields. If you want them all as fields, you can do that. You can have them all generated as local variables and then selectively decide which ones you want to make fields later on. It also supports sort of a flat layout versus sort of a nested block layout. So if you have a hierarchy of components, you can actually see those in nested blocks, which some people like. There's also, you can do pre-initialized fields. So rather than having the widgets initialized in line, they're actually initialized where they were created. And finally, for anybody coming from the far distant VA Java world, who might remember the lazy declaration style from VA Java, where you have each widget defined in its own method, we support that kind of generation as well. Tool supports very nice internationalization. So initially, if you're just dropping widgets on the canvas, you're going to have a bunch of hard-coded strings for each of those widgets. Not something you want to have if you have an internationalized app. Obviously, you want to pull those strings out into resource bundles. So we start by clicking on the little world icon up here on the toolbar. And that opens up the externalized strings dialog. It identifies all of the strings in our little application here. There are basically two widgets with strings. But we need a place to actually extract that to. So we need to actually create a string source. In this case, we want to generate an app constants class that's going to hold those definitions for those extracted strings. So to give you an example of the code it's going to generate, let it go ahead and do that. Select all of the widgets, tell it to externalize them, and then what it does is automatically creates keys and values for you. At this point, we just have a single default locale. If we want to deal with multiple locales, different languages, we can just click on the new locale button. That brings up a list of known locales, or you can create your own combination of language and country code. I'll pick French here, and it generates a new locale. I've already provided the translations, or at least what Google told me the translations were. I apologize to anybody who actually speaks French. And then the tool goes and generates the appropriate resource property file. So we have a default locale with English translations and our French locale with the French translations. And now you'll notice that up in the toolbar, the drop-down list now actually shows us the locales we have in play here. So if I select the French locale, you see that the strings all update to show the French text. If I switch back to the default locale, it switch back to the default text. The nice thing is, I can actually continue to work. If I were to make changes to these widgets and change their text, rather than updating the text in the actual source of the class, it'll actually update the appropriate property file. So if I'm in the default locale, it'll update the default property file. If I'm in the French mode, I'll update the French property file. And I can also go down here, change the property files, and then see the results reflected back in the UI if I want. The tool also has a very nice support for visual inheritance. both through hierarchies, so visual hierarchies like a base class with a couple base widgets, and then various derived subclasses, or containment hierarchies. So if you want to create a custom composite, expose some components, and then show that, and I'll actually do a demonstration of this a little bit later. So with visual inheritance, let's start with a real simple example here with a couple of widgets. One of the things I can do is I can expose various properties. So if I wanted to actually make this reusable, in a subclass, or maybe if it was a composite, I want to expose things like the text on this label, so I could actually change it somewhere else. So I can right-click. If I right-click on that text property and select the expose property command, it offers to create a new property, a new public property with accessors, and it goes ahead and generates the appropriate, I don't know if you can see that at this resolution, but it generated basically an accessor pair for that particular label property, or that text property of that particular label. And then I can also, if I want to expose an entire widget, for example, this button here, maybe I want to change its label, maybe I want to be able to add an event handler to it, I want to basically access it publicly from somewhere else. So I can right-click on the widget, select Expose Widget, it offers to create an accessor, and then generates an accessor for it. Now once you've done that, now I've got a subclass. Now the subclass automatically shows the widgets inherited from the parent, although I can't actually click on any of them except for the button. And now I can basically add additional widgets to the subclass, and also change the public properties of the inherited components. So for example, I added this last name field. Well, maybe I want to change that label up here to first name. So I can just change that label text, and it basically reflects that properly. So this label text property was basically the one we created in the earlier step, and was automatically picked up by reflection. And you can see the source code was generated using that new property. Likewise, I can change properties of the inherited fields. If I want to, I could direct edit the button, change its label, and it goes ahead and uses the accessor for the button, and then changes the appropriate property. But I could add an event handler, or pretty much do anything to that widget that I wanted to at this point. UI factories. Another useful way to be able to reuse components. You can create obviously you can create custom widgets, create composites of widgets, but if you just have cases where you want to have a variety of different, say, customized buttons, maybe a search button, or almost any kind of widget where you're going to be using the same widget definition, the same properties over and over again, you can basically right-click on the widget, select the factory, create factory command, and that pops up a wizard where you can tell it the factory class you want to create, the name of the method you want to create, and it shows the various properties of the widget. And in this case, for our little search button, we want to create a new static method on this factory class that creates the button and returns it. But you can imagine this could be arbitrarily complex with other properties, and then this actual factory element can actually be added to the palette as a first-class element. So if I wanted to add a whole bunch of search buttons to a layout, or use them over and over again, I could do that very easily. And here's another example with take this label here, maybe I'd made it right justified, done a bunch of other things to it. I can extract various properties, maybe have it pass in the string while hard-coding other properties. So you can make these you can make them fully parameterized and then hard-code various properties inside the factory. Tool also has a morphing capability, which basically lets you change any widget type into another widget type. So for example, if I had started out with a button, I could right-click, morph. It shows a bunch of similar types, as well as I could access subclasses or any arbitrary widget I want. And it actually will, in the UI, it'll change that widget from one type to another, maps over all the properties, and updates all the source code for you. So for example, I can change button types, or a real common case here would be if you started out with a list box and you discovered later on in your UI that you didn't have enough room for a full list box and you wanted to convert it into a drop-down list, you can basically do that, and it preserves all the widget properties that you set up at that point, event handlers, anything like that that makes sense. And again, of course, it wouldn't be useful unless it provided full support for all the various built-in widget types and all the various panel types in GWT, and it does that. So things like absolute panel, flow panel, dock panel, grid, flex table, layout panel, and pretty much everything in between. And the last slide before I go into the more advanced demo also supports graphical menu editing. So if you want to put menus into your application, you can start by dropping in a menu bar, and then you can drop, I could drop a cascade submenu in there, start adding items to it. I could add cascading submenus out to other levels, add submenus to that. Add separators. I can use drag drop to rearrange those menu items. And again, I can also use direct edit to edit any of those menu items. So very easy to create menu bars and menus. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to switch back into the live demo here and show some of the more advanced features. So just to show you some of the, just start off with some of the bidirectional editing I showed you earlier. If I drop a button on the screen, give it some text, switch back over to the source, change the label, instantaneously reflected back in the design view. So again, you can work in either direction. If I were to put this into the mode where you actually saw the source and design view simultaneously, you could actually be typing into the source view, and then you can set its how often it synchronizes, and then watch it update the design view. So a very, very nice way to, even if you prefer to work in source, it's a real nice way to see a live sort of preview of what the UI is going to look like without having to go through actually launching the application, going through dev mode, all of that. It's basically sort of instantaneous feedback for you. Let me add a couple more widgets here. Go into the source. You see that it's basically generating nicely formatted source. Let's say I want to take let's take this button here. Oops. I mentioned I can do refactoring, so I'll right click and say refactor, extract method, call it create my button. And now it's extracted that component out of its own method, and the design view is still working just fine. In fact, if I were to change the label on this button, it's reflected properly in the design view. If I move it around, change it here, it updates it in the appropriate place. So again, it basically has an AST model of the entire class. It knows where every widget is defined, where every property is defined. So it really doesn't matter how you refactor the generated code. So that's a very unique feature of this tool. And it actually makes it really easy if you're doing things like visual inheritance. If you break out certain widgets into methods, you can then just override just certain methods to add or change various widgets and do some very, very powerful visual inheritance. Let me show you what you can do with custom composites. This is really fun where you want to start doing custom, creating your own custom widgets. So let's start with a empty composite. I've got a basically empty horizontal panel here. I'm going to drop in a label. I'm going to drop in a text box, and I'm going to drop in a button. I don't like the variable name of this, so I can change the variable name if I want to. Likewise with the button. See, it just basically derived it based on the text. Well, one thing I noticed is I don't really like this layout. So this is a horizontal panel. If I look at the generated source code, maybe let's morph that into a flow panel. So right-click, morph, and changes it into a flow panel, updates the source for me. Now I've got these three widgets. Let's save that. Go back over to our empty entry point here. Drop that custom component on the screen. Hold on. there's our widgets. Now let's go back to the custom component here, and if I were to say, add another button or anything like that, if I switch back over to the entry point, it automatically detects that class change, so it's going to basically has to reload the class loader, pull in that new widget definition, and show it to me. Now this composite isn't very, or this new component isn't very useful if I don't actually expose any of these properties. So if I come back over to the label, right-click on it, select expose property. Again, you can see the accessors it wants to generate, and it went ahead and generated those accessors for me. Save it, come back to my entry point, let it reload that class. And now, you notice that this composite now has a new property, automatically picked up by reflection, and it actually uses that new property appropriately. Likewise, if I go over and take one of these buttons, I can right-click on it, expose widget, come back over to my design view here. And now you'll notice that widget actually shows up as a child, since it's actually now a publicly visible component, and I can do anything I want to it. I can change its label. I could right-click on it and add event handlers, so on. Here, let me show you what we can do with a built-in CSS support. So let's drop a couple more. So the CSS style names, any CSS styles that are defined in the CSS for this project will show up, and I can just select them if I want to and apply them. Or if I want, I can go ahead and create a new CSS style for that button. Edit it. There's a built-in CSS editor, so I could do things like pick the size of the widgets, the style of the widget, maybe the color. I'll make it a big blue button here. I could set the background, set margins if I wanted to, put borders, pretty much any of the CSS styles. And let's actually set this widget to use that style. And then anytime I go and actually change CSS style, so if I actually go back into my project, find the CSS, oh, wrong project. Oops, hold on. If I actually come in and change the CSS by hand, maybe I'll change this to red. You see it automatically gets picked up by the design surface. Now maybe if I wanted to create a factory, maybe I like this style of button, I want to use it over and over again. If I look at the widget definition for the button, let's say I want to make it a search button. So let's change it to change the text to search. Let's change the style, or let's make it a send button actually, because I got a style for that already. And then right-click on it, select factory, create a new factory called my factory. And I don't want to expose I don't want to hard code the size, so let's go ahead and take that out. Tell it to create a create send button method. And actually in the process, it's actually going to rewrite that code to now call my factory creation method, and it went ahead and created a factory class with that new static method in there. If I go back to my entry point now, I could actually, at this point, add this right to my palette. So add, let's find my factory class, my factory, find that one method. And it's added that to the palette. I could drag drop this element and put it anywhere I want. Let's put it back up with the rest of the buttons. And now if I click this palette command, it'll basically create a new send button for me using that factory command. So if you think about that, by creating factories of common UI components, you can basically have a whole palette of really highly customized, reusable components and make them available to everybody on your team quite easily. I'm going to show some internationalization. I noticed that it picked up the CSS style change there too. If we click on the internationalization tool, tell it to extract those. Well, first let's look at the source code here, because we have a bunch of hard-coded strings. And let me get rid of one of these buttons just to make it a little simpler. So we have hard-coded strings right now. Let's internationalize this class. We'll create an app constants class. Tell it to externalize all the components. It's generated the keys and values for me and updated the source code appropriately. So no longer do we have any hard-coded strings. And it's also, at this point, it's created that app constants properties file, which I'm going to open that up. Pull it down here so you can see it. And now if I go back in the design view, and if I change anything, notice it updates the property file for me rather than, and leaves the source code, which has already been internationalized, completely untouched. And again, if I had a second language, it would work that way as well. Now I'm going to do a slightly more complex example. So I'm going to close some of these classes I don't need anymore. And I'm going to do a real simple example showing how to attach a custom composite to a cell table. So first I have a little domain class here, very simple person class, first name, last name, male, true or false, and age. And then I've already built a person composite, which basically has fields for editing each of those properties. It's basically just a little very simple flex table. And you can see the source for this class. And what it does is it has fields for each of the components. Anytime any of those text fields changes, it automatically updates the embedded person object that was passed in, and it has accessors for setting the person for this composite, getting the person, resetting it to a new person, things like that. So very, very simple custom composite designed to edit this very simple person class. So let's take this, let's start out with an empty entry point class. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this person composite on the screen. I'd like it to fill the entire width, so I'm going to start dragging it out, hold the control key down, and let go. It pulls it to 100%. Then I'm going to add a button, call it add, and finally let's come down and add a cell table. And a cell table is basically parameterized by a type of object. So I'm going to tell it to make this cell table work with my person object. Get an empty cell table. Not very useful unless we add some columns. Well, first of all, let's make it fill the entire available width as well, and start adding some columns to it. So I'll add a text column. Call this first name. Add another one. Last name. number column for age, and a checkbox column for whether the person is a male or not. And so far, it's gone and generated code for all of these columns, but this is where we have to start actually adding some intelligence to this. So it's basically just generated some default text for the column. So I'm going to go in and tell it to do something more interesting. So for the first name column, I want to get basically the oops. Yeah, this should be an accessor for that. Yeah. There we go. Get last name, and object get age. And for the button, I want it to basically add the person object here. So I'm going to right-click on it, tell it to add a click handler, and I've actually got some methods. All right, add some methods here. Hold on. Oops. I just got to pull out my, oops. Bear with. All right. Pull out some code I'd written before to do some of this work. I also want to take this person composite, make it into a field, do the same thing with the table. And on that click handler, I'm going to call my doAdd method. I've also got a method that sets up the data provider for me, so I'm just going to call that as well. And hopefully, save that, and let's try launching it. And if I start adding some names, it works the first time. Thank you. I was sweating bullets there for a second. So a real simple example, hooking up a custom composite to a cell table, and that is pretty much the end of the demo that I wanted to show. So let's go back to the slides, and then we can wrap it up. So what did we talk about? First of all, Google Web Toolkit, a great way to build web apps, as hopefully many of you know. Google Plugin for Eclipse, a great way to build GWT apps. And the UI Designer, a great way to build GWT web UIs. So at this point, happy to, anybody wants to ask questions, just use the microphone there in the back of the room. And I'll put up a thank you with basically links you can go to get the documentation, the wiki, the GWT blog, etc. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
What do you see as future direction for the UI binder?
For the UI binder?
Yep.
In terms of the UI designer, or?
Yes. Like, are you looking at higher speed, more features? What's?
Oh yeah. Well, first of all, the goal of the UI binder is to stay completely current with GWT itself. So as new features get added to GWT, as more capability gets added to UI binder, they'll be immediately surfaced in the UI design tool at the same time. So we try to keep them. Back when we were at instantiations, we were usually lagging, 5 or 6 weeks behind. Now our goal is actually to be current with any new, since we're part of the team, be current with any new releases.
As a Python guy and not a Java guy, I've been very interested in GWT, but I've been trying to figure out how do I put that on the front end of a Python backend like Django. Can you give me any guidance?
Unfortunately, I'm not a Python guy, and I really can't help you with that. But if you give me your card, I'd be happy to find out some information for you.
Okay, well, I've actually got 2 questions. One, I didn't see you demo any of the designer with the UI binder itself. Does it support that?
Oh yeah. I mean, in fact, I could just.
Okay, and the second question is actually, how well does the designer work with a pattern such as MVP?
With a what?
MVP, Model View Presenter, where all your logic is elsewhere and your UI design is in a single place?
There's actually, with one of the more recent releases, we actually added support for MVP. In fact, there's even an MVP wizard that will create an entire structure for you.
Oh, nice.
But as far as the UI binder, I could say create a new UI binder composite here. Let me just do that real quick. And there's your standard XML for the UI and notice it shows XML source rather than just plain source. Switch over to the design view here in a second. Very first time I have to access this, it takes a few seconds, and and then I can just go about doing what I was doing before. Start adding widgets. Switch back over to the XML source. You see it's basically added XML source rather than Java source. So it works quite well with UI binder as well.
Oh, thank you.
Earlier in the presentation, you had a split view between the GWT designer and the code view. How do you access that? I'm still trying to figure it out.
Well, one thing I didn't show is basically extensive properties or preferences the tool has. So if you go into Google Web Toolkit Designer, you can basically, one of the first properties is the editor layout. So you can say, do you want the notebook, which order you want the notebook tabs? Do you want them above each other, split pane, side by side? And there's a bunch of other things for like setting coding style, changing how event handlers are generated. And by the way, if you have the full version, which actually shows up under the window builder option, you get actually a whole bunch of additional preferences for really fine-tuning stuff, like setting things like the auto rename pattern for variable names. So when you type in text for a widget, how does it automatically decide what the variable name should be for that? So you can have control over the patterns involved there. So there are a bunch of additional preferences there.
Great, thanks.
How does the bidirectional updates deal with components that are dynamically generated at runtime? So say like I have a grid of components where the size of the grid is determined at runtime.
Well, so the question is, how does it work with dynamically created components as opposed to statically created components? And the basic answer is it doesn't really. Really, the tool deals with static UIs, so anything that's sort of dynamically created, it really doesn't know about it, so it can't really render it. So if you had a flex table or a grid that you're going to add components to dynamically, you would see the empty flex table in the design view. You wouldn't see any of the widgets you're going to add at runtime. That's unfortunately one of the limitations.
Okay, but it basically deals with gracefully. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
I've been asked if you could put up the last slide.
Sure, that's a good idea.
My question.
Oops. All right.
And
there you go.
I was wondering how well it plays with other development patterns, like using Gin. If there's any issues.
I honestly don't know.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
But if you want to give me your card, I could find out about that. Yeah.
What about dealing with existing components, existing designs you have?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the tool actually works remarkably well with handwritten code or code that you already have existing. So I would say just give it a try. And I mean, one of our goals is to keep improving that. So if you have come across cases where it does not do a good job rendering your handwritten code, either whether it's Java code or UI binder code, I would encourage you to actually send us an example. Maybe strip it down to just the minimum that you're willing to part with. Take out anything that's proprietary, but send us examples that don't work, and we are very interested in working with those examples and making them work with the tool and improving it over time. So,
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any facilities for test generation?
Actually, in the full version of the tool, there actually is a JUnit test generation wizard that just creates the a GWT JUnit stub for you, but it doesn't. We don't have any like UI, like automated record playback testing, anything like that for this tool. No.
Okay. Any plans for that, or?
It's something that's been talked about, but at this point we don't have any plans to do that.
All right. Thanks.
When it comes to databases, do you have it so it'll automatically link when you create, like you create the first last name, like you want that to link to a database, like you can create a database and then automatically pull it in like you did before? Is there an option in there for that?
We don't have anything like that. We do have for GXT. If you were using GXT, we actually have support for the GXT data binding model, which basically is if you have a database or you have a POJO, plain old Java object, any kind of data source, you can hook those data sources to UI elements. Once or whenever GWT gets to the point of having its own data binding API, we would obviously build in support for that as well. But at this point, in the basic UI designer tool, there isn't really any support for that with basic GWT.
Okay, thank you.
But it's definitely something we would be very interested in.
Could you show how you add a widget to the palette?
Sure.
I saw how you were doing it with a composite. I'm more interested in a class that extends from another.
Right.
widget.
So if we basically, it's quite simple. So if we pull up any one of these classes here, you basically just right-click on the palette, say you can add a category. I can add a component to existing category, and you basically just choose the class. So if it's a subclass of button, my button, you just find it, and it'll automatically. Then you can give it a description that'll show up if you hover over the component in the palette, and you can pick which category you want it to go into, and that's it. Hit OK, and there it is on your palette.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions? Well, I guess I can give you all back a minute and 30 seconds. Thank you for attending.